I was driving home late one night after a long shift, exhausted and barely keeping my eyes open. The road was empty, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. I live out in a rural area, so it was just miles and miles of empty fields and thick woods on either side. I had about 10 minutes left until I got home when I noticed something strange ahead. A figure standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down, thinking it might be a hitchhiker, but something felt off immediately. They weren't moving, just standing there, perfectly still. As my headlights hit them, I could make out more details. It was a woman, barefoot, wearing a white nightgown that looked old and dirty. Her hair was long and matted, hanging over her face, completely covering it. I stopped the car a few feet away. Unsure of what to do, I rolled down the window just a crack and called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" No response. She didn't move at all. Her head was slightly tilted down, but she didn't even flinch at my voice. It was like she didn't hear me or didn't care. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to leave. Now, I inched the car forward slowly, hoping she'd move out of the way, but she didn't. She just stood there, completely still. My heart was racing, and I knew something was very, very wrong. I reversed a little and thought about turning around. But before I could make a decision, she moved. Her head snapped up, and I finally saw her face. Or, rather, the lack of one. Her eyes were hollow, like deep, empty pits, and her mouth was twisted into a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across her face. She took a step toward the car, her bare feet dragging on the pavement, and I froze. That's when she started running. I slammed the gas pedal, speeding forward. But she was fast, much faster than any person should be. She was keeping up with the car, her twisted grin never fading as she sprinted alongside me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel panic rising as she slapped her hands on the side of the car, trying to get in. I don't know how fast I was going, but after what felt like forever, I finally lost her. I didn't look back. I didn't dare stop until I reached my driveway. Slamming the brakes and jumping out of the car, I ran into the house, locking every door and window behind me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those empty eyes, that horrifying grin. The next day, I convinced myself it was some kind of hallucination. Maybe I was just too tired. But deep down, I knew better. 2 days later, I saw her again. Not on the road this time, but standing at the edge of my backyard, staring at my house. That same grin. When I saw her standing at the edge of my backyard, I froze. She was just there, motionless, her face still twisted into that impossible grin. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, but there she was, framed by the trees, just barely visible in the fading evening light. My heart started pounding as that feeling of dread crept over me again. Thick and suffocating, I shut the curtains, trying to calm down. I kept telling myself she couldn't get in. There were locks. There were walls. I was safe inside. But my mind was racing, replaying the image of her face. That grin, those hollow eyes, the way she'd kept up with the car, like she wasn't human at all. I tried distracting myself, watched TV, scrolled through my phone, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see her peeking in. The thought alone sent chills down my spine. Eventually, I convinced myself to go to bed, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure what it was, just a faint, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send my pulse racing. I lay there, listening, hoping it was just the wind, or maybe an animal outside. But the longer I listened, the more distinct it became. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I didn't want to look. Every instinct was screaming at me to stay under the covers, to not move, but I had to know. Slowly, I turned my head, just enough to glance at the window, and there she was. Her face was pressed against the glass, that awful grin plastered across her features. Her hollow eyes stared right at me, unblinking, her breath fogging up the window. She tapped again, her fingers pale and skeletal, leaving smudges on the glass. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just lay there, paralyzed with fear, hoping she wouldn't try to get in. Suddenly, she stopped tapping. She slowly raised her hand and pointed at me, her grin widening, as if she knew something I didn't. Then, without warning, she turned and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found muddy footprints outside my window. They led from the edge of the yard all the way up to where she had been standing, perfectly clear in the dew-covered grass. But there was something else, written in the fog on the glass. In jagged, messy letters was a single word, soon. I haven't seen her since that night, but I know she's not gone. Every evening, I feel her watching, waiting. I don't know what's going to happen when she comes back, but I'm afraid I won't be able to stop her. After that night, I became paranoid. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep, couldn't do anything without thinking about her, about when she'd return. That word on the window, soon, haunted me. It was a promise. I knew she wasn't done with me. I thought about calling someone, a friend, the police, but what would I even say? There's a faceless woman chasing me through the woods and tapping on my windows at night? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, I was starting to think I was losing my mind. A few nights later, I decided I had to do something, anything. I couldn't just wait around for her to show up again. So, I started researching, scouring forums and paranormal websites for answers. Most of the stories I found were ridiculous. People claiming to have seen ghosts or spirits, offering up sage-burning rituals or cryptic mantras to ward off evil. But none of it seemed real. None of it felt like it would work. Then I came across a post buried deep in a thread about shadow people. The post was from years ago, but it described something that made my stomach drop. A figure with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Following people, appearing out of nowhere, getting closer and closer until they finally took you. The person who wrote it didn't offer much advice, but they did mention one thing that stuck with me. It's not your house she's attached to. It's you. Running won't help. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart racing. I had thought about leaving, getting out of the house, maybe even moving away entirely, but if this was true, it didn't matter where I went. She'd follow me. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shadow seemed to shift and move in the corner of my eye. But the night passed without any sign of her, and for a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, she was gone. Until the next morning. I walked out to my car, bleary-eyed and exhausted. As I opened the door, something caught my attention in the corner of my eye. On the hood of my car, scratched deep into the paint, was another message. She's coming. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. My hands were shaking as I took a closer look. The letters were jagged and uneven, as if they'd been carved with something sharp. But there was no one around, just an empty street, silent except for the wind. I rushed back inside, locking every door and window behind me. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't just sit here waiting for her to show up again. That night, I armed myself with a kitchen knife and sat in my living room, all the lights on. I kept my eyes on the windows, watching for any sign of movement. But the hours dragged on with nothing. The silence was maddening, but I forced myself to stay awake. Around 3 a.m., the power cut out. The house plunged into darkness, and my stomach dropped. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and ragged, as I stood there in the pitch black, gripping the knife so tight my knuckles turned white. I knew she was here. And then, I heard the tapping again. It started at the back door. A soft, deliberate tap. 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 My heart was pounding so loud in my ears I could barely think. I held the knife in front of me, inching toward the door, my legs trembling. The tapping continued, getting louder and faster as I approached. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the handle, shaking. But I knew I had to face her. I couldn't run anymore. I swung the door open, knife raised, and there was nothing. Just the empty yard, bathed in the dim light of the moon. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, but there was no sign of her. I let out a shaky breath, stepping outside to make sure. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after days of no sleep. But as I turned to go back inside, I saw it on the ground. In the dirt were footprints. Bare, dirty footprints, leading away from the door and into the woods behind my house. I knew I shouldn't follow them. I knew I should turn around, lock myself inside, and never look back. But something compelled me. Maybe it was the fear. Maybe it was the need for answers. I don't know. But I followed. The woods were eerily quiet as I made my way down the path, the knife still clutched in my hand. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. The footprints led deeper and deeper, until they suddenly stopped in the middle of a small clearing. And there she was, standing at the edge of the clearing, her face hidden behind her matted hair, that same nightgown clinging to her thin frame. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, waiting. I should have run, but I couldn't. She slowly raised her hand, pointing at me again, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Her hand was dripping with something dark, something thick. Blood. Before I could react, she lifted her head. The grin was gone, replaced with an expression of pure, unfiltered rage. Her eyes, still hollow and black, bore into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then, she spoke. A single word, whispered in a voice so low and guttural it barely sounded human. Mine. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the house, locking the door behind me. But I know it doesn't matter. She's not just coming anymore. She's here, and she won't stop until she gets what she wants.
Me.
After that night in the woods, I was barely functioning. I hadn't slept in days. Hadn't eaten much either. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there, dripping with blood. That word echoing in my head, mine. I was terrified to stay in my house, but there was nowhere else to go. I knew running wouldn't help. She'd follow me no matter where I went. So, I stayed, barricading myself in my room at night with every light in the house on. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling that she was always there, watching, waiting. I started seeing her everywhere. Sometimes, it was just a flash, a glimpse of her standing at the edge of the woods, or out of the corner of my eye, peeking around a doorway. Other times, it was more real. I'd hear the tapping on the windows, the creak of the floorboards in the middle of the night. One evening, I found muddy footprints leading from my front door all the way to my bedroom. The door was wide open when I got home. She was inside. One morning, after another sleepless night, I sat down and did the one thing I hadn't tried yet. I called my mom. I didn't tell her everything, just that I was feeling overwhelmed, scared, and didn't know what to do. She could hear it in my voice. Without hesitation, she told me to come stay with her for a few days, get away from the house. I almost said no, afraid to bring whatever this was to her place, but I was desperate. I agreed, packed a bag, and left. The drive to my mom's house was nerve-wracking. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sitting in the back seat. But the road was empty. It took a couple of hours, but when I finally arrived, I felt a small wave of relief. Mom's house was warm, welcoming, safe. I hadn't felt safe in so long. She didn't ask too many questions when I got there, just hugged me and told me everything would be okay. That night, for the first time in weeks, I actually fell asleep, but it didn't last. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was my mom moving around downstairs, but the steps were slow, deliberate, too heavy. They weren't hers. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening as the footsteps grew closer. I could hear them coming up the stairs. One by one, the wood creaking under the weight. I knew who it was. I knew she'd found me. There was a soft knock on the door. My body froze. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting. The knock came again, louder this time. Then, her voice, low, raspy, and ice cold, called my name. Let me in. I couldn't move. Couldn't scream. All I could do was stare, wide-eyed, as the doorknob started to turn, slowly. I don't know what made me do it, but I jumped out of bed and pressed my body against the door, holding it shut with all the strength I had left. She knocked again, harder, the force of it rattling the door against my back. "You can't hide," she whispered from the other side. "You're mine." I stayed there, holding the door closed, shaking, until the knocking stopped. The silence was almost worse. I waited for what felt like hours, my back pressed against the door, until I was sure she was gone. When I finally let go and opened the door, the hallway was empty. The house was quiet. The next morning, I told my mom I had to leave. She was worried, but she didn't push. She thought I was just overwhelmed, maybe dealing with stress. I couldn't tell her what was really happening. I drove back to my house, feeling defeated. No matter where I went, she'd follow me. She wouldn't stop until she had me. When I got home, there was something new waiting for me. Written in large, jagged letters across my front door was one final message. "Tonight. I don't know what's going to happen tonight, but I know it's not going to be good." I can feel her getting closer, like she's closing in on me from every direction. I've locked every door, every window, and now I'm sitting here, knife in hand, waiting for her. The air in the house feels heavy, thick with something dark and dangerous. It's hard to breathe, hard to think. I hear footsteps upstairs now. I know it's her. If I don't make it through this night, and someone finds this, know that I tried. I tried to fight her. But some things you can't escape. She's here, and she's coming for me. The footsteps grew louder, each one sending a jolt of terror through me. They were slow, deliberate, as if she was toying with me, savoring every moment before the inevitable. I gripped the knife so tightly my hands were shaking, knuckles white. My heart was racing, hammering in my chest like it was trying to break free. I kept telling myself I could fight her, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. She wasn't human. Nothing about this was normal. Nothing about her was something I could just stop with a weapon. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I just sat there, waiting, feeling the cold air in the room grow thicker, heavier. The silence stretched on, unbearable. Then came the knock. Slow, rhythmic, just like before. Tap, tap, tap. "Let me in." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried through the door like she was standing right next to me. I pressed my back against the wall, as far from the door as I could get. My mind was racing, panic rising in my throat. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. She was here. I was trapped. The doorknob started to turn, and I felt my stomach drop. It was happening. She was coming in, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. "Why are you hiding?" she whispered, her voice closer now, like she was already in the room with me. "You're mine." The door creaked open slowly, painfully slow, the sound making my skin crawl. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted from my spot, running for the back door, my legs trembling beneath me. I don't even remember grabbing the keys, but suddenly they were in my hand as I fumbled with the lock, desperate to get out. Behind me, I heard the soft shuffle of bare feet on the floor. I finally got the door open, but the moment I stepped outside, everything went cold. The air hit me like a wall of ice, and I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't even scream. My breath fogged in front of me as I realized she wasn't in the house anymore. She was out here, too. Slowly, I turned around. She was standing in the doorway, her head tilted, that same twisted grin on her face. Her eyes were as hollow as ever, like two endless black pits. She took a step toward me, her dirty, bloodied feet dragging on the ground, and I stumbled back, my legs barely holding me up. "Don't run," she said, her voice almost playful now. "You can't run." I did the only thing I could think of. I ran into the woods. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away from the house, away from her. The branches scratched at my face, the ground uneven beneath my feet, but I didn't stop. I could hear her behind me, her footsteps fast, relentless. The woods were dark, the trees closing in on me. But I kept going. My lungs were burning, my legs aching, but fear was driving me forward. Every few seconds, I glanced back, expecting to see her right behind me. But all I saw was shadows, twisting in the moonlight. Suddenly, I tripped over something, a root. Maybe, and I went down hard. The knife slipped from my hand, skidding across the dirt. Pain shot through my ankle as I tried to stand. But it was no use. I couldn't put weight on it. And that's when I heard it. The humming. That same eerie tune she always made. Soft and distant, but getting closer. I was lying there, helpless, as she stepped out from the trees. She didn't run this time. She didn't need to. She just walked toward me, slow and steady, that grin never fading. "You should have stayed," she whispered, crouching down next to me. Her face was inches from mine, her breath cold against my skin. "Now it's time." I closed my eyes, the fear overwhelming, choking me. This was it. She'd won. I felt her fingers brush my face, cold and bony, and then she leaned in close to my ear and whispered one final word. "Mine." And everything went black. I woke up hours later. The sun was just starting to rise. The woods bathed in a faint, gray light. My whole body ached. And for a moment, I didn't understand where I was or how I'd gotten there. Then it all came flooding back. I scrambled to my feet, my ankle throbbing, but I didn't care. I had to get out of there. I limped back to the house, terrified of what I might find. But when I reached it, the door was shut. Everything looked normal, except for one thing. Carved into the door, right where the other messages had been, were two words, "Not yet." I don't know what that means. I don't know why she let me go. But I know one thing, it's not over. She's still out there, and she's waiting. For me. Since that morning, I've been living in constant fear. No matter how normal things seem, I know deep down that it's not over. Every time I step outside, I feel her presence lurking just beyond the trees. Inside the house, every creak, every gust of wind makes my heart race, as if she's about to make her move. Days passed, but there was no sign of her. The scratches on the door stayed. The words "not yet," a permanent reminder that she wasn't finished with me. I kept trying to figure it out. Why hadn't she taken me that night? What was she waiting for? I decided to leave. Staying in the house wasn't an option anymore. And even though I was terrified she'd follow me, I had to try. I couldn't handle living like this. I booked a room in a hotel in the next town over and packed a few bags. My plan was to leave in the morning. That night, I barely slept. I was too on edge, waiting for the tapping on the window or the sound of footsteps creeping through the house. But the night passed without incident. In the morning, I threw my stuff in the car and took off. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. As I drove further away, the tightness in my chest started to ease, like I was finally putting some distance between me and her. Maybe I'd be able to start over. Maybe she wouldn't be able to find me. But halfway to the hotel, the radio cut out. Just static, hissing through the speakers. I tried changing the station, but it stayed the same. Nothing but white noise. And then I heard it, the humming. That same soft, eerie tune coming through the static. My blood went cold. I gripped the wheel, trying to keep the car steady, but my hands were shaking. The humming grew louder, clearer, until it felt like she was right there in the car with me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my heart stopped. She was in the back seat. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine through the mirror, her grin wider than ever. She didn't move, didn't say anything, just stared at me, her matted hair framing her face like a shroud. I swerved, nearly running off the road, my pulse racing. When I glanced back again, she was gone, but the humming, it didn't stop. It filled the car, wrapping around me like a thick fog, suffocating. I pulled over, gasping for breath, trying to get control of myself. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the steering wheel, waiting for her to appear again. But she didn't. The car was empty. Finally, I drove the rest of the way to the hotel, my nerves completely shot. When I arrived, I checked in quickly and locked myself in the room. I didn't leave for 2 days. Too afraid to step outside. Too afraid that she was waiting. But on the 3rd day, I woke up to something worse. The word "soon" was scratched into the mirror in my hotel room, deep and jagged. She had found me. I was sure of it now. There was no running from her. I didn't know what to do anymore. It didn't matter where I went. She was with me. That night, I made a decision. If she was going to take me, then I needed to face her. I couldn't keep living in fear, waiting for her to make the final move. I had to know why this was happening to me. So, I went back to the house. It was dark when I arrived. The house looked abandoned, almost haunted, with the overgrown yard and the scratches on the door still there, like a warning. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to step inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt her presence. The air was thick with it, heavy and cold. I stood in the middle of the living room, gripping the knife I'd brought, my hands trembling. "I'm here," I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty house. "What do you want from me?" For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. And then, I heard it again, that soft humming, coming from upstairs. I swallowed hard and headed up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the top, I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her back to me, that same dirty nightgown hanging off her thin frame. This time, I didn't run. I didn't look away. I walked toward her. She didn't move until I was right behind her. Then, slowly, she turned to face me. Her eyes weren't empty anymore. They were filled with something else. Anger. Maybe desperation. Her mouth opened. And for the first time, she didn't grin. She just stared at me, her lips trembling. "You took my place," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. I froze. "What? What do you mean?" "This is my home," she said, her voice cracking. "You took my place." The room spun as her words sank in. She wasn't some random entity. She was tied to this house. And somehow, by living here, I had taken what was hers. "I didn't know," I whispered, lowering the knife. "I didn't mean to." She stepped closer, her face inches from mine. Her breath was cold, sending a shiver down my spine. "You need to leave." "I tried," I said, my voice barely audible. "But you followed me." She reached out, her cold hand brushing against my cheek, and I flinched. But instead of hurting me, her touch was soft, almost gentle. "You'll never be free as long as you're here," she said, her voice almost sad. "Leave, and don't come back." I swallowed, my heart racing. "If I leave, will you?" "I'll be here," she said softly. "Always." I didn't hesitate. I ran out of that house and didn't look back. I packed what I could and left town the next day. I don't know where I'm going yet, but I know one thing. I'll never set foot in that house again. She's still there, waiting. But now, I know she doesn't want to take me. She just wants what's hers. And I'll never make the mistake of going back.